You weren't born hating yourself. That feeling, so familiar it almost feels like home, was planted, watered, and nurtured by a world that profits from your self-doubt. Think about it. Who benefits when you shrink yourself, when you second-guess every move, when you look in the mirror and see nothing but flaws? Industries thrive on your insecurities. Old wounds passed down like family heirlooms keep you trapped, and somewhere along the way, you started believing that self-rejection was just a part of life. But what if it's not? What if self-hate isn't an undeniable truth, but a carefully crafted illusion? This isn't just about recognizing where that voice in your head comes from. It's about taking back control. Because the moment you start questioning it, the cracks appear. What if you were never supposed to fight yourself in the first place? What if the real battle is against the systems, the narratives, the expectations that made you think you weren't enough? Breaking free isn't about forced positivity or empty affirmations. It's about unlearning, about seeing the game for what it is. And once you do, you'll realize something they never wanted you to know. You were never the problem. No child enters the world believing they are broken. But before you even knew what self-worth was, someone was already defining it for you. Maybe it was the way your parents measured love in achievements, the way a careless remark made you feel small, or the way approval always seemed just out of reach. Dr. Gabor Mate once said, "Children don't get traumatized because they are hurt. They get traumatized because they are alone with their hurt." When a child constantly feels like they are not enough, too loud, too sensitive, too much, or not enough of something, the mind does what it must to survive. It turns the blame inward. If the world only rewards a certain version of you, then maybe the real you isn't worth keeping. But it doesn't stop there. As you grow, society takes over where childhood left off, refining self-doubt into an art form. Beauty standards whisper that you'll never measure up. Hustle culture tells you that your worth is tied to your productivity. Social media floods you with carefully curated perfection, a silent reminder of everything you lack. The world doesn't just suggest you should be better, it convinces you that who you are is inherently wrong. Philosopher Alain de Botton puts it bluntly, if other people do not seem to value us, we are bound to find it hard to value ourselves. Over time, the external noise becomes internal law, and you stop questioning where these standards came from. You enforce them yourself. That's when self-hate stops being something you experience and starts being something you are. You don't need someone else to criticize you anymore. You do it instinctively. You see failure where there's growth, flaws where there's uniqueness. The voice in your head no longer sounds like a parent, a teacher, or society. It sounds like you. And that's the real trap. Because once self-judgment feels like self-truth, breaking free isn't just difficult, it feels impossible. But here's what they never told you. That voice was never really yours to begin with. If self-hate was planted in childhood and shaped by society, social media is the machine that keeps it alive. Every scroll is a reminder of what you should be: perfect skin, effortless success, a life that seems just out of reach. But what you're seeing isn't reality. It's a highlight reel, a carefully curated version of the truth. We compare our behind the scenes with everyone else's highlight reel, and nowhere is that more true than online. You don't see the self-doubt behind the perfect selfie, the loneliness behind the extravagant trip, or the frustration behind the hustle. Yet, without realizing it, your brain starts stacking your raw, unfiltered life against someone else's polished illusion. The result? You always come up short. And then there's the dopamine loop, the invisible leash that keeps you chasing validation. A like, a comment, a follow, they feel small, but they tap into something ancient, the need for belonging. When your worth feels tied to engagement, your self-perception becomes volatile, rising and falling with every notification. Social media platforms don't just reflect insecurity, they monetize it. The more you question yourself, the more you scroll, the more you seek approval from a faceless crowd that will never truly see you. As Tristan Harris, former Google ethicist, puts it, Never before in history have the decisions of a handful of designers had such an impact on 2 billion people's thoughts. And when those decisions are designed to keep you hooked, breaking free requires more than willpower. It requires awareness. But comparison isn't inherently toxic. In fact, it can be one of the most powerful tools for growth, if used correctly. The key is intention. Looking at others can inspire, push you forward, and expand your sense of possibility. The danger comes when comparison shifts from learning to self-destruction, when instead of asking, "What can I take from this?" you tell yourself, "I'll never be enough." The truth is, there will always be someone ahead of you, someone with more, someone who seems to have it all figured out. But their success isn't your failure. And the moment you shift from measuring yourself against others to learning from them, you take back control. Social media isn't inherently the enemy. Your relationship with it is what defines whether it fuels you or destroys you. It sounds twisted, but self-hate can feel safe. If you tear yourself down first, no one else can do it for you. It's a defense mechanism, a way to stay ahead of pain, to control the narrative before the world gets a chance to weigh in. If you already believe you're not good enough, then rejection stings less. If you assume failure before you even try, then disappointment feels expected, almost manageable. This is why self-criticism can become an addictive habit. It creates the illusion of control. But here's the detail. Instead of protecting you, it traps you. The more you use self-judgment as armor, the heavier it becomes, suffocating the very parts of you that long to be free. And then there's the strange comfort of shame. As destructive as it is, it can feel familiar, even earned. When you've lived with self-hate long enough, letting it go feels like stepping into the unknown. Who are you without it? What happens when you stop punishing yourself? Sometimes, people hold on to their self-hate not because they want to suffer, but because they fear what comes next. Growth means responsibility. It means no longer hiding behind, "I'm just like this," or "I always fail." It means risking disappointment, stepping into uncertainty, and daring to believe you deserve better. And that can be terrifying. So instead, shame becomes a home, a place where nothing changes, where failure feels predictable, and where hope is safely out of reach. But self-hate isn't just a mindset, it's a cycle, and cycles demand repetition. When you see yourself as worthless, you make choices that reinforce that belief. You procrastinate on things that matter. You settle for relationships that drain you. You sabotage opportunities before they can reject you. And each failure feels like proof, solidifying the idea that you were right to doubt yourself in the first place. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy that keeps you stuck, convincing you that this is just who you are. But the truth? The cycle only continues if you keep feeding it. And the moment you recognize that, the moment you start questioning the comfort of your own self-sabotage, that's when cracks begin to form. Because if self-hate is something you do, then it's also something you can stop. Your mind is a storyteller, but not every story it tells is true. Self-hate thrives on cognitive distortions, subtle mental traps that make your thoughts feel like facts. You fail at something, and instead of seeing it as a moment, you turn it into a statement. "I always mess things up." Someone criticizes you, and suddenly that one opinion outweighs every compliment you've ever received. You assume people think the worst of you, so you shrink yourself before they even get the chance to form an opinion. These distortions don't just happen. As I said, they become the lens through which you see yourself, reinforcing a version of reality that was never objective to begin with. And the scariest part? The more you believe these thoughts, the more real they feel. This is where confirmation bias takes over, the brain's tendency to seek out information that supports what we already believe. If deep down you think you're unworthy, your mind will filter out every sign that contradicts that. Let's say you're in a room full of people who appreciate you, but one person seems indifferent. Where does your attention go? Instead of seeing the warmth around you, you zero in on that one cold glance, convincing yourself it means something about you. This isn't reality, it's selective perception, a mind trained to find proof of self-hate. And once you start to see it, you realize how many times you've done this before. how many moments of love and acceptance you've dismissed. How many times you've ignored evidence that you're more than your worst thoughts. So, here's the real question. Who told you that you weren't enough? A parent who was too broken to love you properly? A teacher who projected their own limitations onto you? A society that needs you to feel small so you stay in line? And more importantly, were they right? Most of us go through life accepting these narratives without ever questioning them. But if you take a step back, if you really examine the source, you might see something you never noticed before. The voices that shaped your self-hate were never speaking the truth. They were speaking from their wounds, their fears, their conditioning. And you don't have to carry that weight anymore. Freedom from self-hate begins when you stop outsourcing your worth. For too long, you've let the world be the judge, chasing approval, shaping yourself to fit expectations, measuring your value by external validation. But the truth is, as long as your self-worth depends on outside forces, on praise, success, attractiveness, or belonging, you will always be at their mercy. The real shift happens when you move from proving your worth to simply owning it. This doesn't mean complacency or passive self-acceptance. It means recognizing that your value exists before achievement, before validation, before anyone else's opinion. From that foundation, you build, not to prove yourself, but to become yourself. As Nietzsche put it, become who you are. Not who they expect, not who fear makes you, but who you were meant to be before the world told you otherwise. But breaking free isn't just about thinking differently, it's about treating yourself differently. Self-compassion isn't a feeling that comes and goes. It's a practice, a discipline. It's catching yourself in moments of self-criticism and choosing to respond as a friend would. It's understanding that failure, imperfection, and struggle don't define your worth. They refine your growth. Too often, people mistake self-compassion for weakness, for a soft excuse to stay the same. But real self-compassion doesn't coddle, it challenges. It calls you to rise, not because you're not enough, but because you are. It's standing in front of the mirror, seeing every flaw, every mistake, every scar, and deciding to move forward anyway. Because if you can extend patience and understanding to others, why should you be the only one excluded from your own kindness? The way you talk to yourself has a decisive impact on your life. This isn't about delusion or blind self-acceptance. It's about shifting from destructive self-talk to a mindset that fuels growth. The reality is, hate can be a powerful motivator, but only if you control it, not the other way around. When used as a tool to push through limits, to prove something to yourself rather than to the world, it can light a fire that transforms obstacles into stepping stones. But the moment it turns inward, when it starts breaking you down instead of building you up, that's when it becomes poison. This journey isn't about settling. It's not about convincing yourself that your current reality is good enough and calling it self-love. It's about refusing to let self-hate dictate your potential. It's about looking at the parts of yourself you've been taught to reject and deciding to evolve, not from a place of shame, but from a place of power. Growth isn't about self-rejection, it's about self-actualization. The goal isn't to silence every doubt or erase every insecurity. The goal is to move forward anyway, to step into the person you were always meant to be, unchained from the lies that kept you small. You weren't born hating yourself. That means you can unlearn it. The world won't hand you self-love on a silver platter, and it won't suddenly change to make things easier for you. But here's the truth. You don't need permission to stop suffering. Self-hate is not your identity. It's a pattern, a habit reinforced over years of conditioning. And like any habit, it can be broken. Not in a single moment, not through wishful thinking, but through daily, intentional action. Every time you catch yourself sinking into self-doubt and choose to challenge it, you weaken its grip. Every time you reject the old script and rewrite even one sentence of your story, you reclaim a part of yourself. This isn't about waiting for the right moment, the right circumstances, or someone else's validation. It's about deciding, right now, that you're done being at war with yourself. Because at the end of the day, this is your life. No one else is coming to fix this. No one else is going to hand you self-worth. You have two choices: continue living under the weight of old narratives, or start breaking them piece by piece. Healing isn't a grand, dramatic event. It's in the small, relentless choices to show up for yourself, to demand better, to refuse to be your own enemy. The past may have shaped you, but it does not own you. And the moment you choose to see yourself through a new lens, to replace self-hate with self-respect, to use your struggles as fuel instead of shackles, that's the moment you take your power back.